The Bible doesn't begin with commandment. It begins by telling the story. There's a reluctance, there's a grief. There's not anger at human wickedness, it's grief. He is interested in letting everybody know that Pharaoh is not God. No human being, no human power is God. There is a creator. Pharaoh doesn't control the powers of creation. This unknown God of slaves does, whose name is Yahweh.
Hey everyone, this is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today I'm with Dr. Daniel Hopper. We're talking about how reading the Bible as a narrative will influence our ability to handle deep, hard passages like violence in the Old Testament. Thank you for coming on here today, Dr. Hop. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Staying warm, which is important where I live.
Oh man, bet that's rough. Yeah, it's we've had a couple warm days recently here in Virginia, so it's been
Oh,
nice.
okay.
Uh,
Yeah. Well, we
Crazy.
had a few too.
Oh, there you go. Nice, nice. Okay. So, can you give us a little bit about your background of the book, your education, where you work, all that kind of stuff?
Okay, sure. Well, I'm presently professor of Old Testament and Hebrew at Ashland Theological Seminary in Ashland, Ohio, which is about midway between Cleveland and Columbus. Um, got my seminary degree from Asbury Theological Seminary, PhD from Emory University in Old Testament. In between those two, I pastored for a few years. And then after graduating from Emory, I taught at Centenary College of Louisiana in Shreveport for a while before coming up here. So mainly, I'm really drawn to biblical narratives, how they work, how they're constructed, how we can read them in a way that helps us to understand more fully what biblical writers want us to do with the stories that they tell. So, and particularly have dealt for a long time specifically with the book of Joshua, which is an extraordinary masterpiece of a book in literary fashion. And I've written three books on Joshua, and I'm not sure that I'm still done, but among other things. So that's where I enjoy hanging out canonically, and uh, what I do, what I write about.
That's awesome. Okay, so yeah, you wrote a wonderful book, Violence of the Biblical God, which was very fascinating, and it emphasizes biblical narrative. Uh, can you talk about, just from a general perspective, why it is important for people to read the Bible as a narrative?
Well, that's a great question. So the Bible doesn't begin with commandments or expositions or treatises. It begins by telling the story. And in fact, the entire shape of the biblical canon suggests that everything within it is contributing to a large, I mean, the big story of creation, from creation to new creation. And we all are situated somewhere between those two poles. So, uh, so each of the testaments begins with narratives. So we begin in the Old Testament with a grand narrative that runs from uh, Eden to exile in Babylon, and then rewinds. And then there's another version of that story that is really different. And then in the New Testament, we begin with four stories. So that strikes me as significant and something that causes us, in a way, to, at least me, to approach the Bible really differently, because it's almost as if the Bible is saying to us, begin with the story. The early church, ancient Israel, is saying, begin with the story. This is your orientation. This is how you will learn who God is, what God is doing, who we are in relationship to God, all of those big questions. We begin with narrative, and narratives, in a sense, provide our orientation to the rest of the canon. It's like, it's okay, interpret everything else that you read in light of the narrative. So if we take the Bible's narrativity seriously, I think, then we have to be aware of how narratives work, how we're invited to interpret them, and how we can um, begin with narratives to shape our ideas of God and of ourselves. So narratives are they require imagination. They require us to step into a world. All narrators create a sense of the world and invite us in. And so narratives are not only read, they're experienced. So we enter into a good narrative and it transforms us. We get a sense of the world um, by virtue of our world, by virtue of stepping into this narrated world. And good narratives come out with a sense that our vision has been shaped, our understanding has been shaped in some significant way. So that being the case, for all of these reasons, and then also the narratives. That's why narratives, in a sense, are open ended. They don't really give us the specificity that we want. Sometimes we don't want an either or answer. Jesus's a lot of Jesus's opponents wanted an either or answer, and a lot of times he answered them with a story. Uh, so so there's just something about narrative that engages us on a very deep level and invites us into an experience, a vision of the world that helps us to understand who God is and what God is doing in the world.
Yeah, no, and it's very fascinating because you have it's almost like you have to first be aware, it's a narrative. Specific books like, Genesis or even the Torah in general, where these aren't just a bunch of random stories. They were placed there for a specific reason, and uh, you're missing something if you don't make that connection and of what the writer is trying to say essentially. And that's what I really liked about your book in a lot of ways. So it's you talked about this in your book. It's safe to say that this book wasn't a book to say, "Hey, we fixed all the immoral parts of the Bible. Nothing to worry about." Can you talk about more of what your purpose of the book was, if it wasn't exactly that?
Yeah, well, part of it is that I think that's what most treatments of the topic of God's violence want to do. I mean, they want to provide here's the template. Here's the way that you can just make it fine and tie everything together and get God off the hook. I don't think the Bible lets God off the hook. And I think that's part of the way that it challenges us because it reminds us that there's some things about God that we don't know, we can't figure out. There are some dots that don't connect in our understanding of God, and so we've got all. So I don't think the very nature of the biblical text itself, particularly on the issue of violence, it just has so many loose ends and non-connections and different perspectives and it just throws so many ethical and theological issues at us from so many different directions that it seems to me what the best way to read the biblical text is to mirror in a sense or to extend that conversation that's happening with the Bible into our own faith communities so that and to recognize, and I think this is the big message from reading the narrative that um, God, God's decision to step into the world in um, in a world of violence and sin, cost God something. And what we see in the narrative is that God being pulled ever more deeply into this maelstrom of violence and sin that characterizes the human world. And and it's a consequence of God's decision to uh, choose a family and a nation to be God's purposes. And so, so in the Old Testament, God does this from the center. God is defending kings. God is endorsing. God is protecting, and God is doing various things. In the New Testament, God takes a completely different space. Comes to us in the person of Jesus Christ, on the edge of power, power, victim of violence. And I think it's in Jesus Christ, and my Christian convictions are showing here, but it's Jesus. In Jesus, God is freed because God is freed from all of that um, kind of needing to defend and prop up and work through. We see the fullness of who God is. Uh, and yet, and yet, um, that doesn't seem to have solved the problem for our world either, because we Christians continue to uh, participate in various ways in the violence that configures this world. So we need each other. We need each other to figure out how to live faithfully for God. The Bible gives us lots of pictures of what to do with violence, uh, and they conform to perhaps our own church locations. So some Christians say we got to work from within, just like God did in the Old Testament. Some other parts of the church that say you can't work from within. You're never going to redeem the structures. They're always going to be sinful. So stay apart and set yourself and don't have anything to do with those structures. And there are problems and there are benefits to both of those positions. But Scripture, it seems to me, invites us to have that conversation with people that really believe differently. We need each other to figure this out. And answers are not going to be any easier for us than they are in the biblical canon. I mean, what
Yes.
do we do right now? What do
Mhm.
we do with Russia and Ukraine? I mean, how do we think of that as Christians?
Yeah, for sure. Uh, this getting an echo for some reason. Um, this this whole story is, if anything, maybe it doesn't ease all of our tensions as far as morality and all that. It's extremely fascinating, at the least, to say that you know it does push us to really analyze, talk with each other, and maybe that's why, one reason at least, God included this into His inspired words. As you talked about, as a way to reflect on ourselves and see who we are and how that compares, and of course, as you said, in current times too. So that's really crazy to think about. Um, so for Genesis 1 to 11, you talked about how that is the beginnings of the Pentateuch, the first five books of the Bible, and it was put there for a specific reason. Can you talk about how reading that from a narrative approach, picking specific things out that might be beneficial as we go on in the story, like why it's important? Can you go through Genesis 1:11 talking about that?
Hmm. Okay, sure. So uh, I like to think of Genesis 1 through 11 as the backstory for Israel's story. So Israel's story begins, our story of redemption, renewal of creation begins with the calling of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And so Genesis 1 through 11 answers a lot of the big questions, um, sets some real significant um, kind of ways of understanding God and God's relationship with the world that really give us what we need to understand the significance of what God is doing in entering into the world, stepping into a world of violence and sin, and choosing to partner with a human being. So, that said, um, a lot of that backstory, I think, has to do with, first of all, portraying God as someone who's not only other than and apart from our world and who we are, but also intimately involved, caring, and nurturing. And I think a lot of times we bring into the Old Testament, a reading of the Old Testament, this idea of, God is just angry. And God's angry because people sin. And so God punishes people who sin. And God punishes them violently. And it's a couple of the most massive instances of divine violence are right there in the flood, Genesis 6 through 8, and in the story of, later on, the story of Abraham and Sodom and Gomorrah. So, so I'm not sure exactly what you're looking for at this point, but I would say we begin with Eden, and we begin with this picture of God as someone who can speak the whole universe into being, and yet can also enter in and walk around in a garden in the cool of the evening, looking for his creatures. And we get the sense of this God um, who is a caring God, who is a God who is generous, who gives, who blesses. And that's where we begin. And so, what we see uh, in God responding when human beings decide they can do a better job of deciding what is good and what is evil for creation than the Creator, who called everything good. Um, so, is God responding to this problem of human defiance, the circumstance of human defiance? And I think one of the things that I just want to take out of that, and we can deal with some specific instances, is this idea that early on um, we have to untangle that idea that God is a judge and God is violent, and that God is angry, and that those are all tied up with who God is. So the first emotion that is attributed, that we are told that God experiences with response to human sin, is not anger, but it's grief. It's God is grieving about making humanity as he sees the creation disintegrating before him. Um, God's response to the first act of violence when Cain kills Abel is mercy rather than violence. So God does not kill Cain for killing Abel. God banishes Cain, and then Cain says, God, I'm scared. I'm afraid somebody's gonna do to me what I did to Cain. And God says, I'll take care of you. I'll put a mark on you. And so God um, God responds to sin, but not always with punishment. Sometimes with mercy. And God um, uh, is angry, or God does violence, but is not always said to be angry. Matter of fact, God doesn't get angry at anybody in Genesis. The first time that we see God we're told that God gets angry is when God speaks with Moses, and Moses tries to wiggle out of trying to of going to Egypt and freeing the people. Um, so we have this beneficent God, this blessing God, this generous God, And I think reading carefully these instances of creation and flood and moving forward um, really takes us in a different direction with God than that stereotype.
Yeah, so you mentioned the flood, and I really liked your interesting take in the book there. You kind of talked about how, uh, you know, the flood, he kind of sent the flood, but he didn't. Can you talk about that here?
Yeah, it sure can. So the flood has actually, there are two introductions to it. And the first introduction, God grieves. We're told, first of all, God grieves. God looks and sees that human wickedness and violence are ripping creation apart. And so, but we're told twice that God grieves that situation. And then God says, in the middle of those two comments about God's grieving, I'm I'm going to have to erase humanity off the face of the earth. And then we move into a second introduction, which complements that first one and gives us, in a sense, a little different perspective on what God is doing and why God is doing that. And that is uh, God, and this is where translators really, I think, have that image of the violent, judgeful, wrathful, punishing God in place because uh, in that second introduction, God talks about the sees the corruption. That's the way it's usually translated. But there's a wonderful set of Hebrew word plays. There's a Hebrew word that's repeated through that introduction, and that is the word for something disintegrating or being ruined. And so the idea is what we're told is that if we follow the Hebrew text, and that's repeated, and there's a lot of really interesting word plays without getting too lost in the weeds. But um, God sees a ruined world, and the narrator tells us that God looks at that world. If we follow the Hebrew text, if God is looking at that world, and God sees where all of this violence and disintegrating and degeneration is going. So God literally says, "I'm going to ruin creation." So God ruins what is already ruined in a way of say, which is a way I think of saying that God just enters in and brings that process of ruination to its logical end. And the flood in the ancient Near East is that symbol of complete chaos, complete disintegration, no order. Everything is just fluid and deep and without boundaries and orders. And virtually all translations of that particular text have God saying, "Well, I've determined to destroy the world." And instead of saying, "I have seen how ruined the world is, and I'm going to ruin it." In other words, I'm going to get involved in that ruination myself and bring it to a conclusion. So there are two things that come out of that for me. Number one is the reluctance of God to step into this situation. Matter of fact, in the flood story, God keeps his distance. God pretty much stays apart from everything. But there's a reluctance, there's a grief. There's not anger at human wickedness, it's grief. Um, and then, secondly, is this idea that instead of what the translations are telling us, where God just says, I'm going to destroy everything, God's mode is to enter into a ruined situation and bring about the end of that situation so that God can recreate, which is what happens after the flood. A lot of creation imagery in Genesis 9. And even then, you'll recall, uh, God says to Noah, I'm not going to destroy, I'm not going to let this happen. I'm not going to destroy the world with water again. So it's a remarkable portrait in a sense of divine ambivalence, divine grief, and is our first indication that God doesn't destroy because God gets angry at sin. God's participation in violence is reluctant. In the flood, it's somewhat indirect, and it's not without some grief on God's part.
Yeah, so I'm really curious to, a wonderful summary, by the way. I'm really curious to hear what you think about this idea. So, you know, a big issue for a lot of people with the flood is that, God's killing a whole bunch of people. That could include children or, it's like some people would assume that there's got to be some good person out there, even though the text doesn't says that only Moses or only Noah's family is good. Um, so for a lot of people, they're gonna deal with that moral issue there, and you talked about how like it's destroying something that's already destroyed, but at the same time, like for a 21st century reader, when we're listening to that, we're thinking like, well, it's God. He could do anything. Why couldn't he have just, uh, you know, snapped his finger and everything goes away? There doesn't have to be drowning or something like that. Why, why do you not see an issue with that scenario there?
Well, I do see an issue, and I probably should say right up front, I don't believe the Bible gives us any real, or gives us few certain answers on this topic. It strikes me, and this gets back to the Bible's narrativity. It seems to me that the Bible's more concerned with shaping our way of thinking about violence, getting us into conversation with each other, and working through together how we live faithfully and constructively in the world today. So that just caveat for your readers now, or your viewers. I don't know that I have any real answers, and there are a lot of loose ends, and I think they're there by design. But to get to your point, the narrator does say right at the beginning that God sees that every human being is just completely ruined themselves, and the earth is full of violence. So it is problematic, and yes, God could snap God's fingers and say, okay, I'm gonna make you all friendly now, or I'm just gonna get rid of the bad people, but everybody's bad. That's part of the how the narrator wants us to enter the story. And God could, if God snapped God's fingers and said, okay, um, everything's cool now and I'm going to make everything right, God would override human dignity, and this kind of human ability to in relationship to God to say no and to destroy the earth. I mean, the risk God takes at the beginning with human beings is they can decide to defy God or to opt out of the relationship. And if that happens, there's going to be an ungodly mess of a world. So the world is full of violence. Um, and in a sense, I think the important thing is that, yeah, uh, people are dying and killing each other. I mean, it's just happening. And God becomes a part of that. And there are lots of ways you can go with that. But um, God gets involved in that in order to steer it toward a certain end so that God can rebuild. That doesn't remove some of the sting, but it does tell me that God, again, God's perpetration of the flood is reluctant and strategic, and for the end of building up. To quote some of the prophets, sometimes God has to pluck up in order to plant, and tear down in order to build. And that's what I see God doing here in the flood.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so next you talked about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and, a crazy scenario there that happened. Can you talk about the story in general, just a summary of it, key points, and how you talk about that with your book?
Okay. So the story of Sodom and Gomorrah takes place immediately after angels visit Abraham and Sarah and tell Abraham that Sarah is going to bear a child in her old age. And we move from there. And actually, the angels are on their way. So there are three visitors that show up and visit Abraham with the news, and it's really enigmatic. The story's really enigmatic. One of them stays with Abraham, it turns out to be God, and two others go to Sodom. They're messengers, and so the striking thing. So I'll just the whole story. It seems to be keys on again, in a sense, an entrance into God's thinking. So God is pondering. God is wondering what to do, and God is thinking to himself. I wonder if I should tell Abraham what I'm planning to do, which is kind of it's first of all, it's interesting that we get a little to think about God deliberating, that answers don't come to God quickly in this case. God is thinking this through. Number one, God's going to destroy, and he says, this outcry from Sodom has become so great. I'm going to have to go down there and see for myself. So this represents actually the first descent of God into the world, which I take as a way of talking about God's choice to get involved in humanity. And so God and Abraham, so God discloses to Abraham, and Abraham says in response, God, I know you very well by now, and shall not the judge of all the earth do what is judged? You're not going to destroy that city. If there would be 50 people there who are righteous, and God says, okay, you have a point. Well, how about 45? Would you destroy the city if there were 45? And there's this back and forth between Abraham and God in which God is seeking, in a sense, feedback from his earthly friend, who it's just to me, it's a remarkable picture of the elevation of humanity. God, uh, think of the kinds of people that you go to for feedback on a big decision. They're usually not casual acquaintances. They're usually people that you really trust, you and whose opinion you value. And so in the lead up to Sodom and Gomorrah, we have God and Abraham just God being very responsive, as if God is saying, I want you to talk me out of this. And so there's that reluctance again, so that when God does what evidently God concludes he must do, which is to wipe out the city and save a few righteous people. That's Lot and his family, who happen to be related to Abraham. Um, we are prompted to to keep all of that conversation in the background, as if to say God was looking for a way to do something other than, which means that if God had to, I mean, there must have been something so virulent, so the word for the cry is the same as the blood that cried out from the ground with Abel's blood, um, and later on the cry that goes up from the Israelites in Egypt. And so you've got another thread there where God says, if there's something so egregious that's going on, so destructive, so mean and degenerate, I've got to go down there and take a look, and I've got to do something about it. So again, God does not do that because he just got mad. All right, this is just really disgusting, and I'm going to have to do something about this. It's a really different portrait of God, I think, if we follow how the narrator is shaping the story, because the narrator has something to say through all the stories and shapes the stories accordingly. And I think one of the things the narrator wants to say through this story is God's participation and generation of violence is strategic, and God undertakes it reluctantly when God must. So,
And so, just to be clear for the audience, maybe not as familiar with the story, how does that story end?
okay, yeah. Well, it's really kind of a disgusting story. So the angels come to Sodom. So there are two cities that God it are just again. It's the same kind of wickedness cropping up again, and God evidently decides this time I'm going to just have to do a surgical strike and take this out so that it doesn't infect the creation again. So the angels go to Sodom and they're given refuge by Lot, who is Abraham's um, relative. And during the night, some of the men of the city come out and they surround Lot's house and they say, "Bring out these men." And they basically want to rape the angels, which is a huge violation of hospitality. Hospitality is a huge um, imperative in the ancient world. Um, we kind of take it lightly today, but someone you are sheltering, you have an obligation to protect them. And so anyway, so the angels blind the men, and then they tell Lot and his family, you gotta get out of here, and you gotta get out of here quick because God's going to take this place out. And so they leave, and God devastates, destroys the entire city. Yeah,
Wow, that's pretty crazy. Okay,
yeah,
so so continuing, we have a really really interesting story where God, as long a thousand stories later, we get to the book of the Exodus. The Israelites are in Egypt. You have Moses is talking with God, and then Moses is also talking with the Pharaoh, trying to get the Israelites out. And the Pharaoh doesn't want to do that, so appears that Pharaoh's heart gets hardened. Can you talk about uh, that in regards to your book, and specifically like how it seems almost a little odd that God would harden Pharaoh's heart, because if you harden someone's heart, it implies that they have no ability to do good after that. And it almost is like God doesn't want him to do good. Can you explain your thought process behind that whole story?
sure. So there are two repeated refrains that thread the plague and Exodus narratives. One of those refrains that is repeated, you just mentioned, and I should say contrary refrains. So there's the statement that uh, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And then we have statements that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. So we want to say, which is it? Did God harden his heart or did Pharaoh harden his heart? And the narrator's answer is yes. So the other refrain is God saying throughout, particularly throughout the plagues and up through the Exodus, the actual crossing, that God is doing things so that Israel will know that He is Yahweh, that He is the Lord. But there's also a repeated refrain, and there are even more of these that say, so that the Egyptians will know. So that God is concerned not only that this enslaved people knows who He is. God wants Pharaoh and the Egyptians to know who He is. And so we ask, well, why would God want people to know who God is? And where I go with this is that first of all, we take Egypt. Uh, Egypt is the dominant power in the world in the time of Moses, and Pharaoh is the alpha male of kind of these oppressive empires that we see in the ancient Near East, and he's like the apex of human power, and particularly in Egypt. Pharaoh is a divine being. Pharaoh is the one who oversees the order of our society, holds all things together. And Egypt is populated by gods who have been worshipped for centuries, if not millennia, and who, in a sense, guarantee whose job it is to keep everything in place and running smoothly. But they're only doing this by oppressing and enslaving other people. And one of the remarkable things when God calls Moses, to me, is that when God, one of the excuses that Moses makes when God tells him to go to Egypt and speak to Pharaoh, Moses says, "Well, who should I tell them you are?" So there's a sense that God isn't even known or recognized among his own people. So we have this scenario where God, an unknown God of slaves, steps into a world of well-established, powerful deities. And as I read the story and as I read the refrain, God God is interested. God is interested in letting everybody know that Pharaoh is not God. No human being, no human power is God. There is a creator. Pharaoh doesn't control the powers of creation. This unknown God of slaves does, whose name is Yahweh. And so what we see in the plagues is, in a sense, God turning the very powers of creation that the gods of Egypt claim to order, turns those very powers as destructive forces um, against Pharaoh and against the Egyptians until the very end. So that's the refrain, so that they will know. What about that refrain? Pharaoh hardened his heart, the Lord will harden his heart. Well, the first time that hardening heart is mentioned, it's where God says to Moses, "I will harden Pharaoh's heart." So if you think for a moment about kings and particularly emperors or pharaohs, what really distinguishes their power? It's the ability to will something and to make it happen. A king says, "I decree this," and it happens. So it strikes me as just uncommonly just that God says, "Oh, you think you have that kind of power. I'm going to take away from you your ability to make your own decisions. And in that, I will demonstrate that you are not ultimate. I am." So Pharaoh does harden his heart, but there's a number of times where Pharaoh does, and you're right. And Pharaoh finally relents and says, "Okay, you can go." And then we're told God hardened his heart. So it's like God wants to make a show, and there's a whole kind of intensification of this um, throughout the story. But God wants to make a show, wants everyone to see that the gods of Egypt, or the gods that are well known and worshipped for millennia in the ancient Near East, are not ultimate. Neither are the rulers. And so this is a spectacular display of a deity who is unknown saying, "I'm here."
Wow, that's very fascinating. Okay, so something that really I found I wasn't sure about from like a moral standpoint that I found interesting. What you've talked about the I guess the 10th plague, which is the the firstborn.
Right.
I guess God kills the firstborn of the Egyptians, and that sounds kind of crazy. a lot of these issues with, the conquest and, the flood, it's like, in this group of people would include the children, the innocent people, but if God is specifically killing the firstborn, it's almost like he's specifically killing the innocent people. Um, can you talk about your thought process behind that, and your specifically thoughts in regards to morality and all that?
Well, I don't like it, and it disturbs me too. So it's hard to know what to do with that. It does seem harsh, uh, and it's hard. I do note that these situations, most of these situations where God is involved in massive killing or killing of innocents, happens in the process of God raising up Israel to be His people. So it's a hard thing. The biblical writer kind of finesses it a little bit because God sends a destroyer, so God doesn't do it himself, which doesn't really um, doesn't really solve a whole lot. But if we look at the message, the message is Pharaoh and the patriarchs of Egypt do not hold the power of life and death. So there's a message there. It's a tough one, um, but my moral response to that is to say, yeah, it's problematic for me, and I wonder why Moses didn't intercede also for the Egyptian children the way that Abraham did for the people of Sodom. Uh, but it's tough, and I'll say one of the other messages is to oppressive powers is that it's your power is not ultimate, but also um, your power may actually result in um, your own suffering of violence for your own family, your own people. So that's about the best I can do.
Yeah, it is extremely difficult. I kind of set myself up on that one. I mean, that is what people think my representation of it. At the same time, firstborn doesn't necessarily mean, you know, 1 year old. Specifically, it could be,
Right.
super old. It's essentially the inheritor of the inheritance kind of thing. But that's why it's important. But at the same time, that would include young people, so that's really
It
difficult.
would.
Um, the other really big one, the one that most people talk about, is the conquest, Joshua's conquest, and there's a whole bunch of different, uh, you know, conversations that come up with regards to morality, and it seems like in a lot of these stories that God is telling the Israelites to go and massacre a bunch of people. Can you talk about the whole scenario behind that? What's happening, and uh, how is God commanding all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So that's another difficult one, as you've said very well. So in both of these cases, God uses agents to carry out the violence. So in Egypt, it's a spiritual being, it's the destroyer. In Canaan, it's Israel. So, um, so I think where I begin is with this repeated, again, a repeated refrain relative to Israel's entrance into the land, and that is that the way the Bible, the way that the Bible uh, focuses our attention is that God does this. God brings Israel into the land in order to fulfill the promises God made to Abraham, so that we have to, in a sense, see this story within at least the Bible, the biblical writer wants us to see this story within the context of God taking this people, God's mission to take this nation who is going to be a holy nation, a nation of priests, Exodus 19. And so Israel is going to be God's agent for renewing creation, and that people has to have a land. So land and nation go together. People renew the land, and so renewal has to have a space. So God makes a space. And the way that is talked about in the Pentateuch up to Deuteronomy is that God promises to drive out or expel the inhabitants of Canaan. But when we get to Deuteronomy, the language changes. And Deuteronomy chapter 7 and echoed in chapter 20 is that God orders Joshua to wipe the people out or devote them to destruction. Don't leave anyone alive who breathes. It's quite clear. And the first 12 chapters of Joshua follow that language, use that language. So Joshua takes Jericho, and God wins the victory, and the Israelites wipe out all the inhabitants. And same with Ai, and same at Gibeon. And then there's just report after report, and God wiped them out, and Joshua left nobody who breathed. And chapter 12, the conquest narrative concludes with this list of 31 conquered kings, just to know we did it. We wiped them all out. And then you hit chapter 13, where God says to Joshua, Joshua, you're old, and there's a lot of land that remains to be possessed, which is kind of a whiplash. What? I thought they took all of it. And God tells Joshua to begin assigning territories to the various tribes. And as Joshua does, the language of expelling and driving out returns. So, and it returns in a negative way. So the people of Manasseh could not drive out the Canaanites who lived in these cities. The people of Judah could not drive out the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and they could not expel. So all to say, and then when we get to Judges chapter 1, there's a completely different kind of recap of the whole scene. So all to say that you've got all of this grandiose, exaggerated language about wiping out and killing and leaving nothing that breathed. And then you have this jarring difference where all of a sudden we're told, wow, there's a lot of land that needs to be subdued. And you return to that language. The writer returns to the language of driving out and expelling, which for me is such a jarring uh, situation that its purpose is maybe to look back at all of that language about wiping out and to say, well, maybe it didn't quite happen exactly like that. And when we look at the literature, the military literature of the ancient Near East, that kind of language is conventional. It's the way that a victorious general or king talks about their victories. Matter of fact, there is a pharaoh named Merneptah who erected a victory stela commemorating all of his victories in a place called Canaan. It was about the latter part of the 13th century BC, not too long after the Exodus. And he mentions Israel. And his phrase is basically, Israel is no longer. Basically, I wiped them out. Well, as we all know, he didn't. So, in a sense, God is still violent, but God is not genocidal in that sense, which may be too fine of a hair to split, but uh, it it clues us into the fact that a lot of that language is has theological resonances that we may not pick up immediately. Because when you look at that commandment in Deuteronomy chapter 7, where God says, go in and wipe them out, don't that God says, wipe them out. And then the commandment goes on and make no covenant with them and don't intermarry with them, which in a sense doesn't really follow. If you wipe them out, what's this business about not making covenants and not intermarrying? And I, along with a lot of scholars, see that as a way of Deuteronomy using a rhetoric to say this is not really about wiping out. This is about staying as separate and far away from these people in terms of their religious orientation, their idolatry, their practice as you can. So so God is still orchestrating violence. Um, it's not quite the genocidal violence, but I'm sure probably people are babies and children are being killed. But and I do have problems with saying, well, God, I mean, killed children, this, you killed innocent people, um, and there is this sense, and it's tough. And even John Calvin kind of went there in a way and said there are just some things that are mysterious to us, um, and in a sense, we've got to interpret those troublesome texts in terms of the texts in which we see God clearly, um, in all of God's beneficence and love and grace, and recognize that God, being God's for all of us, still holds the power of life and death. So it's a mystery. It's a problematic issue. Um, but maybe not quite as severe as we're led to think. And again, um, over all of this is this idea that God is somehow involved in the affairs of nations. So there's a little couple of verses, notes, comments tucked away in Deuteronomy 2, where we're told how God drove out the indigenous inhabitants of Edom and Moab, and using the same kind of language, and gave those countries to Moab and Edom. So people are on the move, people invade, people are in conflict with other people. God is somehow involved in that. Israel, in that respect, wasn't the only case. So, that's far enough. There are just lots of there's just lots of threads that we have to connect to think through something as complex as this. And again, I think our real purpose is to say, what do we do with this? How does this literature shape us, and maybe how might it mirror back to us? Maybe its function is to mirror back to us how violent we really are, and how quick we are to endorse violence and wars in the name of God, like what's happening in certain areas of our world right now. Uh, so you know, the early patristic writers like to talk about the Bible as a mirror and as a lamp. So the Bible is a lamp that helps us to live and to see what is true and to follow. But the Bible is also a mirror uh, by which we see both our beauty and our ugliness. And there's a lot of ugly in the Exodus and in the uh, in the Conquest.
Yeah, there sure is. So, we're at the end, and maybe you're not prepared to answer this question. This one's off the cuff. Very last question though. So a lot of people will want to see that specifically the Torah. It is written as a narrative, and they'll see these things where it looks like something God would never do, and so they think to themselves, okay, so it's a narrative. The writer is writing these things to make a point. It seems like God would never do that, and then they might include that. Okay, so most of it, or parts of it are historical, but then, God didn't specifically do these darker parts of it, and that's just the writer, the narrative, specifically something like the flood, where it's like, you know, they had a common tradition of flood. They knew that the flood happened. It's just that, that was what their way of taking the flood and making a moral story out of it, a different kind of truth. Can you talk about your thoughts on that idea?
Yeah, briefly, I think it's. I think we sometimes get overconfident in what in how we can think we know what was in an ancient person's mind, and so I'm drawn to that more historically oriented approach, but I think it gets slippery when we try to reconstruct the past and reconstruct what people were thinking or how they were being culturally shaped. We just don't know. And part of our reconstruction of the past inevitably involves our own projections of our own stuff. So we just don't know. We just don't know enough about the history to make confident assertions about what people were thinking and why they were doing what they were doing. And for that reason, I think that historical reconstruction and pursuing authorial intent is a really slippery foundation on which to make moral and theological judgments. That's why I I just counsel people read. We have the text. So how the text informed by history, but it's the text that shapes us. It's the text that transforms us. It's the Bible itself through which God speaks and that is to be the center, I think, of our conversations, as opposed to, well, he reconstructed it this way, and a lot of those also, it just seems to me, got off the hook again too easily. Well, don't worry about it. God, that wasn't really God. That was just the way people thought about God then, and the Israelites were just importing some ancient ideas. Now deal with the really hard stuff. The God of the Old Testament is the God who is personified in Jesus Christ. Uh, put that together. That's hard enough all by itself.
Yeah, yeah, that's an extremely really good point. Is that a lot of that is speculation, and it seems nice. I really relate to that when we're talking about like the Genesis topic, which is a lot of the interviews I've done on this channel where have so many different views, and for me personally, that a lot of these different views on a lot of it's just speculation. And it's like it's hard to really nail down anything, and you know to even make theological points off that is another whole different question. So that's a really good point there. I really appreciate you saying that. Um, so yeah, is there any other places that we can reach you? Well, not maybe not reach you, but check out your stuff.
Yep.
Any like a website, anything like that, where we can find you?
Um, yeah, just on Facebook. So I'm rather, you know, I'm on Facebook, and that's about it, really. I can be reached at my email address, dhawk@ashland.edu. And always glad to answer queries from serious Bible thinkers.
That's so awesome. All right. Well, this has been really great talking to you, Dr. Hawk. Thanks for going over a little bit, and I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I
Yes, of
appreciate
course.
it. Thank you.
Yes, sir.